Good evening. Welcome to the Kentwood branch of the Kent District Library for our second presentation in a series called Bridging Political Divides, Exploring the Radical Middle, presented by the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan and Kent District Library. I'm Erica Kubik, Director of Programming, and on behalf of my colleagues Michael Van Dennen and Rachel Brooks and the World Affairs Board of Directors, I welcome you tonight. Our mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. To change the world, we believe you must first know the world. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. Tonight, we're going to say a special thank you to our friends at Kent District Library, who annually partner with us to provide this free informational resource to the West Michigan community. And I welcome Randy Goebel, Director of Engagement, to share what's happening at the library.
Thank you, Erica. And welcome to the Kentwood branch of Kent District Library. I'm Randy Goebel, Director of Engagement. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. It's really quiet up here, so I'm glad you can hear me well. So digital risks to democracy, countering misinformation online. I was just thinking about how timely this topic is, not only because we're in an election cycle, but because we did an event last week on artificial intelligence. We had a summit, and one of the most popular topics about this was about how artificial intelligence is being used in social media and the news and with the prevalence of deep fakes. And it's really a hot topic now. But there's also a lot of discussion about how a lot of the social media companies and AI tech leaders are really holding back, intentionally holding back until after the election because they don't want this to be too great of a disruption. So I think there's a lot coming in our future in this area that I'm especially interested in as a marketing person and an information-oriented person. So I'm really pumped up about tonight's event. So why is Kent District Library hosting a Radical Middle series? First, by a show of hands, how many of you were here last week at this event? Oh, wow, great. About half of you. Thank you. So you heard how Dr. Koopman talked about the 7 tribes in the United States, how there's some people on the fringes, generally about 6 or 7%. There's a big bell curve in the top of most people. And, that's really important to think about that, too. Everybody has their place in one of those tribes. And it's actually part of our purpose as a library to further all people. And what that means is that regardless of your perspective or where you come from or what you think or believe, that we strive for you to see yourself in the services that we provide. Not only the services we provide, but our people, our makeup, the collection, everything. So that's our purpose. So Paul Barrett is the Deputy Director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at New York University's Stern School for Business. He joined the center in September of 2017 after working for more than 3 decades as a journalist and an author focusing on the intersection of business, law, and society. Paul's the author of 4 critically acclaimed nonfiction books, the most recent of which is Glock, The Rise of America's Gun, a New York Times bestseller, and The Law of the Jungle, the $19 billion legal battle over oil in the rainforest, and the lawyer who'd stop at nothing to win. At the Center for Business and Human Rights, Paul's focused on primarily researching and writing a series of reports on the role and obligations of the social media industry in democracy. And since 2008, Paul's served as an adjunct professor at the New York University School of Law. He has a JD from Harvard Law School, an AB from Harvard College. And joining Paul tonight is Dr. Darren Wolof, Professor of Political Science at Grand Valley State University. And he'll be engaging Paul in a moderated discussion. After the presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. We'll have microphones at the back of the room. And please exhibit civility to our guests and hospitality to others by asking respectful and succinct questions. The presentation tonight is titled Digital Risks to Democracy, Countering Misinformation Online. Please join me in welcoming Paul and Darren to the stage.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Kent District Library, and welcome to Paul. Thanks for coming to West Michigan and joining us this evening for this discussion. Why don't we start, Paul, by having you say a little bit about the Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. I'm curious because this is not necessarily a combination that we just think of naturally, right? Business and human rights. So maybe you could say a bit about the connection between those two things, what kind of work you do there, and maybe some of the things that led you to the Stern Center and to start this work.
Sure, thanks, Darren, and thanks to the organizations involved in inviting me here today. I'm my first visit to the Grand Rapids area, and I'm very pleased to be here, so thank you. At the Center for Business and Human Rights, we have to overcome the impression many people have that our title is an oxymoron, that business is in some way in opposition to human rights, which of course historically has been the case in many instances. But the theory of our center is that in addition to focusing on government misdeeds that might undermine human rights, it's worth focusing on corporate behavior because in many parts of the world, to some degree in this country, but to a greater degree in other countries where governments and civic institutions are less strong, businesses, global businesses, are actually in a position to make decisions that either promote or undermine human rights. I mean, a classic example would be the way that many products are manufactured today. Take the clothing that we're wearing. Most of it, I would wager, has been manufactured outside of the United States, even if it's marketed by famous brands based in this country or in Western Europe. And then the question becomes, what are the conditions in the factories where the clothes are actually manufactured, whether that's in China or Bangladesh or Vietnam, Cambodia, or any number of other countries. And our center focuses on those questions. What's actually going on in the factories? What are the ways that the companies that are buying the products from those factories, how do their policies affect working conditions, the conditions of the communities in those countries, and so forth. My area is primarily tech policy. So I look at technology companies and how the side effects of their activities, the products and services that they sell, affect to some degree their employees in some contexts, but also, and with more emphasis, the societies in which they operate. And since tech companies in recent decades have gotten so involved in communication technology, and we now do a vast amount, a majority to say the least, of our communication about politics, about civic life, about public health, and many other topics via these relatively new technology platforms, the question arises of what are the side effects of communicating in that fashion? What are the side effects of the very lucrative businesses that have been established, most of them of relatively recent vintage? And those are the questions that I focus on.
Great. So that gets us right into the topic for this evening. You know, the Stern Center and you have worked on some reports about these digital threats to democracy. So I was wondering if we could maybe summarize some of the findings of those reports, thinking especially about the threats themselves, and then also making the link to democracy. Like what is the connection between these threats and the consequences for our democratic institutions, our democratic processes, and our citizenry itself?
Right. Well, there's nothing new about hateful or bigoted speech. There's nothing new about false speech, falsehoods about what is going on in the world. There's nothing new about political polarization and the divisive speech that inflames the electorate and causes people to be at each other's throat. What's new is how we disseminate that speech, how the democratization of being able to project your voice, not just nationally but globally, instantaneously and at no cost, affects the nature of discourse, whether that discourse is about, say, public health policies, what to do in the midst of a lethal pandemic. Do we wear masks or not wear masks? Do we get vaccinated or not get vaccinated? A debate like that would have taken place in the past, but the nature of the debate would have been very, very different in that people in positions of authority would have dominated the debate to a much greater degree. Experts would have been the loudest voices on many of those kinds of questions, whereas today everybody can speak to those questions. On another matter of public interest would be the administration of elections. What's going on with the election this year? Are the polls running smoothly? Are votes being counted appropriately? Or, in contrast, is there a vast conspiracy to defraud the public and manufacture votes or destroy ballots and so forth? Again, those kinds of debates have taken place for generations. But the nature, the way we hold those debates, the way we spread information now, the vast array of sources of information with far less gatekeeping going on, far fewer editors, so to speak, or intermediaries getting between the sources of information and the recipients of the information, changes the nature of the debate. And the effect, to state it briefly, is an exacerbation of a tendency toward polarization. So we've had an increase, as you know better than I as a political scientist, political polarization as measured by political scientists has been increasing since the 1950s, which was kind of the high point of consensus, if you will, in the post-war era. Since then, changes in society, debates about all kinds of social issues, shifts in political loyalties, geographic movement, the changing nature of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and so forth, have heightened polarization. The introduction of earlier generations of technology further heightened polarization, whether that was talk radio, the introduction of hyper-partisan cable news, then came the internet, then came social media on top of the internet. And so social scientists have now been studying this question of, is there a connection between the introduction of social media and the heightening of polarization? That's a question that I've looked into in great detail. I can go into the specifics of the findings, but the basic finding is that the social media research, as well as anecdotal observation of events in the world, observations that everybody in this audience, whether they have a PhD or not, can make, point toward the fact that the means of communication we now use, social media being the predominant one, has significantly exacerbated the degree of polarization over questions such as the effectiveness of elections, the appropriateness of various public health policies, and the debates that we have in our society, just for example, over topics like immigration or sexual orientation. And you could go on and offer other examples. So those are the kinds of things that I look into.
Yeah, so you should dig into the social science a little bit, go a little bit further, because polarization, I think we have a sense that it's a problem, but why exactly? What are some of the consequences of polarization?
Right.
Is it political violence? Is it
Yes,
kind of oppression, or what's going on?
My most recent report, which came out just in September, and was I did the work on it, and we released it with an eye toward the election, looks at the question of the role of social media in connection with political intimidation and violence. And again, just to make sure people understand, what I mean by those terms. I mean, political intimidation, just as an example, would be people have questions about how local election procedures are running. Obviously, you can go to a public meeting of the Board of Elections of your jurisdiction and raise your hand and ask questions about how things work. Or you can send someone an email or call them on the telephone and threaten to kill them because they're an election worker, which is becoming much, much more prevalent. Death threats to ordinary election workers, to people who sit on boards of election, and so forth. There's a question about whether the rise in that type of extreme political intimidation, punishing people basically for doing their civic jobs, is related at all to the way we now communicate online. And the overwhelming finding of social media studies, and we, meaning me and some research assistants, looked at 400 individual studies that have been done going back to 2015, not exclusively on election procedures and threats, that one strain of threat, but looking at political intimidation and political violence. And by political violence, just as an example, I would offer, for example, what happened on January 6th at the United States Capitol. That's political violence. People have a political objection about, could be anything. Do you vote in the next election about that? Do you hold a rally about that? Or do you invade a government building and threaten to kill people in the building? The latter is political violence. The other means are the more democratic approach to resolving differences through debate, campaigning, and elections. And anyway, we looked at these 400 studies, which looked at social media and political activity all around the world in vastly different geographies, different contexts dealing with different issues. And over again, the finding is that there is not evidence that the increasing reliance on social media is the sole or even primary cause of political intimidation and violence. That's crucial. Those phenomena, those pernicious phenomena, exist independent of social media, and of course, pre-existed social media. We've had political violence since time immemorial, right? It's not Mark Zuckerberg's fault that we occasionally try to assassinate a president. But with the introduction of social media, opportunities to recruit people to extreme political causes, to organize them, to actually bring them together, to spread extreme ideologies, has been exacerbated. So a crucial distinction between exacerbation or facilitation, an important role, versus being the sole or primary cause. That's the central finding of that report. And it's important to make that distinction because often, in my view, in an attempt to obscure the debate and to fend off demands for self-regulation or government regulation, the companies that own and operate the platforms will frequently indulge in straw man arguments. They will say, it is preposterous to accuse us of being the sole cause of political polarization, when absolutely nobody who's a serious critic has accused them of being the sole cause of political polarization. Nobody who's serious about it. Instead, there are people like me who trudge their way through 400 social science studies and come up with the kind of nuanced finding that we made in an attempt to make an argument that the companies themselves need to do more to try to screen out content that is harmful, an exercise that they have a complete and total right to do in governing their own activities. And the government, which can't censor much of this communication, no matter how pernicious it may be, the government needs to figure out ways that around the periphery, without violating the First Amendment's preclusion of government censorship, to perhaps require greater disclosure of how the companies are acting on the promises that they are making to filter their own content. So that's an illustration of the sort of work that I try to do.
So it sounds like if we move from like the problems and their consequences, diagnosis, to some of the solutions that you and the Stern Center are proposing, you just outlined kind of two buckets of solutions, one having to do with changing the behavior of the social media companies, right? And the other introducing some kind of additional government regulation with respect
Crucial
to...
distinction.
Yeah, so I wonder maybe you could
each
expand on each of those a little bit.
Absolutely. So the business and human rights is actually a term of art in the human rights world. It is a subdivision of the human rights movement, most of which has historically been devoted to assessing, critiquing, and trying to change government behavior. The business and human rights wing of human rights looks at corporate behavior. So the idea is to try in an open way to reach serious research findings and present them to industry and say, as an alternative to being regulated from the outside, men and women of industry, If you agree with us that what we're proposing is the right thing, we may be wrong, of course, but maybe we're right, or maybe we're halfway right, or maybe you agree with half of what we're saying. And try to implement reforms that you can do on your own initiative without Washington or your state government telling you to do these things. That's part of the theory. It's an idealistic theory, usually doesn't work. Every now and then you get a little progress on the margin. So what could companies do? Well, social media platforms as they exist today, and by social media platforms, I mean Facebook and Instagram, both of which are owned by Meta, YouTube, which is owned by Google, TikTok, which is owned by ByteDance, a Chinese company, and there's a whole separate interesting controversy surrounding that. X, which used to be called Twitter, which is owned by Elon Musk. Those companies those platforms that they operate vary in a variety of ways. They're not identical, they're not monolithic, but they share a certain common technology. That is, they are driven by algorithms, software, that make a vast number, I mean billions of distinctions a day on what content you see and what content you don't see. Think of all the content that is sloshing around on the internet everywhere. Every time you go onto one of these platforms, or you do something else like a Google search, you don't get every piece of potentially relevant information. Your computer would literally blow up if that happened, right? Or you would blow up as you try to absorb billions of pieces of content coming at you in a billion, in hundreds of languages from all directions and so forth. So a vast filtering process is taking place to make all of these platforms work. Choices have to be made. The choices are not made, for the most part, by human beings. They're made by software systems. Actually, it is a form of artificial intelligence, if you want to categorize it. Not the generative artificial intelligence that we talk about in connection with deep fakes, a different type of artificial intelligence. The algorithms are driven by certain imperatives, certain criteria that they use to promote certain content and to demote other content. Think of your Facebook feed, think of, again, Google searching. There's lots and lots of options there. You only see a few of them at first, and then you scroll down, you see a few more. You could scroll all day, and you could see hundreds or maybe 1,000 such things. There's actually a million. If you kept going and forgot to eat and sleep, you could see a lot of content, right? How do the algorithms make those distinctions? The criteria that they tend to emphasize prioritize content that users will engage with. Engage is a term of art in this industry. By engage, the industry means you will comment on them, you will reshare them, you will like it, you will dislike it, and so forth. Why would the platforms invent and create algorithms, that's a fancy word for the software, that prioritize engagement? By the way, they also prioritize something that's simpler, which is simply screen time, how much time you are likely just to stare at a particular piece of content. Why would they prioritize engagement? Evidence that you're interacting with the content, or that you're just sitting there staring at it. Simple one-word answer: advertising. Advertisers use screen time and engagement as a metric for deciding whether they're going to buy advertising with that platform. And if the engagement numbers go up, they're going to buy more advertising or pay more for the advertising they buy. It's a very fluid, it's not a static thing. It's not like buying advertising in a newspaper in the old days, or to the degree newspapers still exist even today, where you're the local auto dealership, you buy the ad for your auto dealership, there it is, a quarter-page ad, and you just hope someone's looking at it. You really have no idea of telling whether someone's looking at it. Now we know not only whether someone's looking at it, but whether they're liking it or resharing it. And the thinking is that if people are engaged, if they're interacting with the content, it means they're dealing with the content, they're staying there, and they're also likely glancing over at the ad that's next to that content. So Mark Zuckerberg wants content that his advertisers will want to put their ads next to. That's why engagement is used as a central metric. But there's a side effect. I used that term earlier. What's the side effect of this business model, this engagement advertising business model? The side effect is that the algorithms that prioritize engagement, and I don't think this was intentional back in the day, way long time ago when these platforms were invented, 2005, 2006. Remember those days? It's so long ago. The side effect is that you will get more engagement from content that provokes emotional reactions, particularly negative emotional reactions. Not like happiness, but unhappiness, anger, fear, dread, a sense of polarization. There's a particular type of polarization that's affective polarization. That it's not just that I disagree with the other guy, it's that I think the other guy's trying to destroy my country and my way of life. When you get those kinds of reactions, people stay on the content, they reshare it, they get obsessed with it. So there's this bad side effect of the particular approach to the technology that has these same algorithms, which are designed to draw advertising, are also exacerbating these negative emotional reactions. What could the companies do? They could tinker with the algorithms which they created. This is not handed down from God. There's not like a divine algorithm. People made them. People can adjust them. They can de-emphasize engagement as a criterion and heighten evidence of authenticity. Where did the content come from? Is there some indication that that might be a legitimate source of information or not a legitimate? All very complicated, not necessarily easy to do, but something you can try to do. That's an example of self-regulation.
But it feels like the way you've explained it, the self-regulation is in some sense at odds at a very fundamental level with their business model, right?
Could be, yes.
So that in some sense gets us to the potential or the possibility of some kind of force, right? Regulation.
Right. Here's the
by
problem.
the only entity that's powerful enough to do this, which is the government, right? But of course, for many of us, that makes us nervous about imposing on free speech and violations of the First Amendment. So maybe you could say a little bit then about some of the recommendations in the other bucket on the government regulation side.
There's a term among tech policy people about certain content that's lawful but awful, or awful but lawful. You can say a lot of really bad things and not be punished by the government for saying those things, right? In this library, outside the library, on the proverbial town square, you can say things that are bigoted, and if it doesn't lead to an immediate threat against another person or a threat of violence, you can say that. That's the way free speech works. You can say things that are false, and the government can't come along and say, stop saying those false things. Stop right now. The First Amendment is the legal mechanism for protecting against that type of government intrusion, and it's a wise protection against having the government tell us what we can and can't say. Very different set of rules for a private organization that sets up a forum for communication, whether in the real world forum like us sitting here tonight or a virtual forum like Facebook. The entities that set those things up can set rules. So what can the government do? It has to move very cautiously. Our prescription has been to use the rubric of consumer protection as a way into thinking about creative but reasonable and modest ways of government intervention. What is consumer protection? Consumer protection is the concept which was enshrined in law in 1915 in the Federal Trade Commission Act. It's before the New Deal. This is a progressive era legislation that basically said when you're in the marketplace and you make promises to people, you cannot be unfair or deceptive in the commercial promises you make. So if I sell elixir and I say this will cure all your ills, and it turns out it's mercury-laced water, that's not legal anymore. The FTC can come in and say, you're promising to sell the all-purpose elixir and you're actually selling poison. We can sue you and shut you down. You sell automobiles. You imply that someone can go from point A to point B in the automobile. If you sell an automobile that has no engine in it, FTC is going to have a problem with that. And on and on. Promises that businesses make to the public and whether those promises are fulfilled. Our theory is that with a modest degree of enhancement, that basic statutory authority that the Federal Trade Commission already has can be used at a starting point to require greater disclosure from these companies. One of the big problems here is I gave you a very learned sounding description of the algorithm. I don't actually know the details of what's in Facebook's or Instagram's or TikTok's algorithm because I can't see it. I don't work for the company. I don't have the authority to do it. Nobody on the outside knows exactly how it works, which makes it very hard to critique it, very hard to complain about it in an intelligent way at a congressional hearing, and so forth. So under the enhanced Consumer Protection Authority that we have suggested that Congress could provide the FTC, along with the resources that would be necessary to put it in place, hiring experts, having budgets to investigate, and so forth, we could find out how many people within Facebook are actually involved in filtering material. How do they interact with the programs that are used to filter out the material that Facebook is already promising the public that it filters out? Facebook already has a ton of rules. No hate speech, no misinformation about elections and about public health policies. And again, on and on, a vast array of rules. The question is, to what degree are those rules actually enforced, and how are they enforced? And if we had a better sense of that, if we had greater disclosure, and outside researchers ranging from public policy people like me to the PhDs in computer science, in economics, in political science, and so forth, had access to this data, we would have the great benefit of having sunshine on these right now very shadowy problems, and the potential at least to demand that the companies on their own dime do a better job, for example, of filtering and fulfilling the promises that they are already voluntarily making. By the way, they have to make those promises. Why? If they didn't promise to prevent there from being child pornography, hate speech, spam of all descriptions, these platforms would be shut down on their own. They would become cesspools overnight if a vast amount of filtering wasn't already taking place. So there is a lot of filtering that's taking place. The problem is it's very ineffective. They don't spend enough time, energy, or money in running the filtering processes that in some ways are at odds with the very algorithms that are promoting the bad material. I often describe these platforms as a combination arson organization and fire department. They spend all morning setting fires with the algorithms that promote engagement, and then they come back in the afternoon and they put the fires out with other artificial intelligence designed to screen out the bad stuff that the first set of algorithms actually promote. It's a little simplistic, but not entirely simplistic.
So I have a lot of questions about free speech, but I'll maybe pose one more, and then we'll go to audience questions. So consumer protection is one kind of legal framework that you're thinking about. I'm also wondering whether there's a role for antitrust legislation. So, you know, one of the inherent features of social media is that kind of being a monopoly is best for all of us in some sense, right? Like it works best if all your friends are on the same social media platform. But this then gives rise to this problem of monopoly and these companies having, in some sense, too much power. So is there at all a role for antitrust as a way to check some of these tendencies?
Right. The short answer is yes. The elaboration on that answer is we are in the midst of a vast antitrust battle that is underway now as we speak, with multiple live lawsuits filed by the federal government and most of the states against most of the companies we're talking about over issues such as the long-standing pattern that these companies have of buying up all potential challengers, rivals, and upstarts, and just mushing them together into one big company. These companies now, you know, are vastly, you know, hugely lucrative, profitable, and influential as a result, which is why there's almost no new government regulation, because the lawmakers at the federal level have shied away from this in significant part because of corporate lobbying. Not the case necessarily at the state level. There are states that have made forays in this regard, California and New York being the leading examples. But the antitrust approach is one that can be taken because the questions there are not about free speech. They're about the agglomeration of economic power and the use of that economic power. So Google has already been found recently, with 6 weeks ago, basically liable under the antitrust laws. And the question now in front of a federal judge in Washington, live as we speak here, with the determinations that are going to be coming out in coming months as to what the remedy is going to be for that, where the possible remedies are splitting off Google's hugely lucrative advertising business, which is the business that deploys all those ads, both on Google, YouTube, and on other companies' platforms, away from the other elements of Google, such as Google Search, such as YouTube, and the many other arms of Google. If you did that, it would be a very dramatic gesture by the federal, a huge intervention. It would cut against all the trends in antitrust law and antitrust enforcement that really began in the 1970s when the deregulatory movement began. Now we're getting very broad and a little bit away from our topic, but what you are actually, because of the extreme nature of consolidation in Silicon Valley, you've actually seen antitrust authorities take initiatives in just the last few years, beginning, interestingly, during the Trump administration, continuing in earnest during the Biden administration, to challenge the degree of economic power that these companies have accrued over the last 15 to 20 years. Now, those efforts, breaking companies up, restricting them from certain practices, those would not go directly to dealing with content-related issues like, people lobbying against people getting vaccinated in the middle of a pandemic. But would it potentially decrease the influence of the companies? Would it put them on notice? Would it change the whole corporate mindset and make them more amenable to thinking, geez, we really better rethink our role in society? We were kind of behaving like we ruled the roost. Maybe we got to rethink a little bit. And as an example of this, think about Microsoft circa 1990s, was sued under the antitrust laws. Ultimately, Microsoft sort of prevailed, but in the upshot of that huge antitrust fight, which took place primarily during the Clinton administration, was that Microsoft engaged in having to defend itself against efforts that it was trying to use its power in software to branch out and exert power in the then new internet. Microsoft was basically backed off the internet for years, and while it's a very powerful company, Microsoft is not a dominant social media company. There's a reason for that. The government used some muscle and pushed Microsoft back some, and the effects of antitrust enforcement can often be indirect. It's not only the immediate remedy, but the mindset change that can take place when the government says too much. The telephone company is too concentrated and too, that was the great antitrust battle of the 1980s, the breakup of the Bell system. Something similar could happen here. Antitrust is another viable alternative, and we're witnessing right now, as we speak, a huge experiment with whether antitrust can be used as a tool to moderate the economic power of Silicon Valley.
Great. Let's get some others involved in the conversation here. There's a microphone in the back. We ask that you come and use that because we have people online who also want to hear the questions. Erica.
And before we do that, let's give Paul and Darren just a quick round of applause. And as you're coming up to the microphone to ask your questions, I've got one just to get us started. And that's really because this is the World Affairs Council. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the global context of these digital risks that you've been outlining here in the U.S.?
Sure. These risks exist all around the world. And in fact, for all the problems we're having in the U.S., they are far more intense in many other countries. So in India, for example, Hindu nationalists are using various platforms primarily there what was once seen as just a messaging platform, but really now is fully a social media platform as well, WhatsApp, to incite lethal violence against Muslims. So people going out and lynching people in the streets because social media is used to forward conspiracy theories about how Muslims are involved in various misdeeds. In Myanmar, the country that used to be known as Burma, whole different dynamic, same basic technological story. There's a Muslim minority population there known as the Rohingya, and there the dominant force in Myanmar, actually a little counterintuitive for us here in this part of the world, although that's just because we're a little provincial about these things, is the Buddhist establishment, allied with the army, has been persecuting the Rohingya Muslims using Facebook, basically saying the Rohingya are doing all sorts of terrible things. They're coming for your women and children. Chase them out of their villages. 700,000 Rohingya were chased out of their own country into neighboring Bangladesh. Facebook was the primary vehicle for the spread of these false conspiracy theories, and the UN itself investigated and said that Facebook was implicated in the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. So those are just a couple of examples, and you can find similar ones elsewhere. You've got political misinformation in Brazil. You have Russian manipulation of information environment in making up stories about who started the war in Ukraine, and on and on and on. On the more optimistic side, the European Union is actually far ahead of the United States in beginning to implement regulatory steps that would actually accomplish some of the very types of disclosure that I was talking about. They don't have quite the same legal structure, but they have now enacted some of these types of provisions. I've borrowed ideas from them. Most of the ideas I put out into the world are not my own. I borrow them from other smarter people. And so we now have a regulatory experiment underway in the EU, and it may have global implications, because if the companies can be pushed into obeying the EU rules, they may end up changing their behavior globally, because the EU is a very big market.
Great. So lots of questions. Go ahead, sir. Speak in the microphone.
Well, welcome to Grand Rapids, Mr. Barrett. And my question is, do you think that the application of libel law will help to tamp down some misinformation? And the old rule used to be malicious disregard for the truth. And I see that is not happening much on the internet right now.
Great question. Really the perfect question. And that's because it opens the door to mentioning Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. Aren't you glad you asked now? Section 230 says that an interactive computer service, which in 1996 meant rudimentary message boards, but today means Facebook, cannot be sued based on the content posted on that platform by a third party. Creates a special liability protection that would preclude the kind of lawsuit, and has precluded the kind of lawsuit you've proposed. When that law was passed, it was designed to protect the then nascent internet industry, which members of Congress, a significant majority of members of Congress, thought, we've got this new industry developing. We don't want to see it suffocated by a wave of litigation. And if we hold the venues, again, then the message board is much smaller, more rudimentary. If we hold them liable for all the stuff that people say on those venues, they'll never get off the ground. They'll get sued left and right, and the industry will be snuffed out. That may have been right. And that law did help the industry get aloft. And then it developed in ways that weren't fully anticipated. And Section 230 has become very controversial. There have been many proposals to either eliminate it, or what I've proposed, which is to significantly limit it and allow for some limited greater liability on the part of the companies to serve as a deterrent to certain types of harmful content. But so far, those restrictions have not been imposed by Congress. And the courts, meanwhile, have given a very broad interpretation of Section 230. And by broad interpretation, I mean they have made the liability shield very effective for the defendants. So what happens is you file a lawsuit against Facebook and against me in court because I said something nasty or false about you. The part of the lawsuit against Facebook gets dismissed before you even, on a motion to dismiss, before evidence even is gathered. And the judge says, sorry, Section 230, by all means go after Barrett if you want to sue him because he said it. And then I say, come out, I got nothing in my pocket, so have at it. And then you walk away realizing there's no point to this lawsuit.
Next question.
Speaking of democracy and elections, has there been progress or what kind of steps have been taken for, say, North Korean, Russian trolling trying to influence the election? It seems like I'm getting at least less badly photoshopped things on Facebook, but there's still some sneaking through.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what has been
You
done.
probably are getting less, anecdotally speaking, because that kind of crude manipulation of social media by Russian operatives, Chinese operatives, Iranian operatives has sort of run its course, and you kind of recognize it, and they kind of recognize that you recognize it. Plus, it's relatively labor intensive if you generate that with actual people sitting in an office building in St. Petersburg, which is what happened in 2015 and 2016 when the Russians geared up their big push, which actually had some impact, not on the outcome. The point was not that they changed anybody's mind. They didn't think they were going to change anybody's mind from Democrat to Republican, from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. That was the very crude interpretation of what was underway. They were trying to get us at each other's throats. They were trying to make people divisive. They were trying to get people to distrust information itself. And if they had a goal, it was to get people not to vote, which is significant. When people don't vote, that has an impact. And they also wanted to see Donald Trump elected, but the Russians did not get Donald Trump elected. The Russians tried to get Donald Trump elected, but there wasn't cause and effect. But that whole approach kind of ran its course. You're still seeing some of that from all of the countries I mentioned, but the Russians are actually much more focused now on Ukraine than they are on our election. That's where their resources are going. And now there's a new threat on the horizon, which is generative AI. Where you don't need 100 people sitting in an office building, a handful of people can using something like using ChatGPT or something like it can now generate far more convincing false information than an actual Russian guy trying to sound like an American in Houston was doing in 2015 or 2016. So we haven't seen artificial intelligence have a big impact on politics yet. It's having generative artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is having an effect all over the place in all kinds of ways. This particular type of technology where you can use natural language to prompt the system to generate very convincing text, audio, or video, that has not had a huge impact on the presidential race, for example. But it's having a big impact. It's causing lots of junior high school kids to be miserable when their devious little classmates put their heads on naked bodies. That's making a lot of kids really unhappy. Sounds like Photoshop, but it's a lot more effective than Photoshop, and it's a lot easier, even easier to do. And it's making a lot of people unhappy because of false pornography. A lot of Hollywood actresses have seen their faces superimposed on porn movies and stuff like that. Very annoying if it happens to you. So artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence is sort of the next generation of problems.
Excellent questions. Another one.
Hi. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd is on record as having said that Fox News or that Rupert Murdoch was a cancer on Australian democracy. And as we know, Rupert Murdoch next took his show on the road to England, and they ended up with Brexit, and now there's Fox News here in America, and has been for some time. And my question is that to what extent can you comment on the current litigation that's pitting the Fox News heirs, some of whom, I believe the majority of heirs, who really want to tone down or change the format of Fox News to a more traditional type of straight up news than maybe, what we're hearing from them today. Is there anything you can say about that? Because it just seems like it's a very long history from where it started to where it is today.
Right. Well, I mean, hyperpartisan cable news, which in this country is dominated by Fox News, but is not, of course, exclusive to Fox News. You've got other, in some ways, even more extreme partisan cable news on the right, and you've got MSNBC on the left, which isn't an equivalent to Fox News, either in terms of its reach or in terms of its avant-garde approach to the facts. But it's still there, and it is still partisan and quite distinct. And you're not going to see Democratic candidates criticized on MSNBC any sooner than you're going to see Republican candidates criticized on Fox News. I don't have any inside skinny on the very fascinating and salacious fight within the Murdoch family between the generations. There was a whole really good HBO cable series called Succession that was sort of a satire of all of that, incredibly prescient. But the important point I think I'd like to make is that when we're talking about social media, it is not the exclusive influence on our politics. I mean, go back to talk radio, look at partisan cable TV, and both of which remain very powerful today. And adjacent to social media, you've got podcasts, you've got websites that are static websites, not interactive social media sites. All of those contribute. It's also crucial to understand the interaction among those media. So where do most people get Fox News today? Whether you think Fox News is great or you think it's terrible. Well, a lot of them have their TV on, of course. But far more people see it split up and in little fragments via their social media feeds. So you can no longer even make those distinctions cleanly. The media are all mixed together and disseminated in highly complex ways.
Next question.
Hi, I just wanted to know.
Can you speak into the mic?
Oh, sorry. I want to know if your September report about political violence and social media is available online to read.
Absolutely. Use the old Google machine to go to the NYU Center for Business and Human Rights, or search even further and put my name, political intimidation, and the Center for Business and Human Rights, and Google will take you directly to the page.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and you should definitely read it. One of the things about the reports is that they're written. Paul's a background in journalism, so they're written in a way that people read and understand, not like the things that academics write. So definitely go look up the reports and check them out.
And I'll jump in real quick to say that I have linked those two reports on the YouTube page that will host this video afterwards. So if you go back to our YouTube channel, find this video, the reports will be linked right there for you as well.
So we're getting close to the end of our hour, but I'm sitting here thinking sort of the classic response to false speech, lies, false ideas within our political tradition has always been that you meet speech with speech, right? And that it's best not to further empower powerful institutions like the federal government or state governments or these powerful media companies and ask them to regulate our speech for us. So how do you respond to that argument that we should just let social media be the Wild West, and we should, when we see false ideas, we should call them out and present what we take to be true ideas, and that's the way a democracy ought to operate, rather than having power brokers who just try to moderate, control, regulate our speech.
When documents like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were drafted in the 18th century, and maybe even into the 19th century, maybe even into the 20th century, that metaphor of the marketplace of ideas made a lot more sense. If someone was saying something you disagreed with on the town square, you'd run out and you'd be the next speaker on the town square. Fast forward to mass media and the invention of the modern newspaper, and then the mass and national distribution of newspapers. You could conceivably start your own publication. The newspaper was coming out in the morning. The next day there was another issue of the newspaper. Write a letter to the editor. Write an op-ed disagreeing with the criticism. Don't buy a subscription, et cetera. You could kind of keep up with the other participants in the marketplace of ideas. When you have an information distribution system that allows individuals to project their messages to millions, if not billions of recipients instantaneously with no filter, and when that distribution system happens to be powered by technology that favors false information because it's novel and it is engaging. Go back to engagement and the effects of engagement and why engagement is promoted. Engagement is not promoted in the healthy democratic sense that we here tonight are engaging with one another. It's engagement to sell advertising based on getting people revved up in a negative way. You're not dealing with the old marketplace of ideas. There's an old saying about, I can't remember the details of it, but a lie will be running halfway around the world before the truth either gets his shoes or his pants.
Gets out of bed or
gets
something
out of
like
bed,
that.
right. The truth can't keep up anymore if you just let everybody go. Think of the ultimate form of what you're talking about. An unregulated online venue. Not just no government regulation, but no regulation at all. Total cesspool, pornography, animal torture, spam, that's what it would be. And so we as a first step, you have to regulate to keep off the spam and the pornography and the animal torture and the bigotry. So you've got to regulate. Then you get to who's going to regulate. Yeah, you don't want the government telling private people exactly what policies they should have on their platforms, let alone making actual content decisions. Thumbs up, thumbs down on a piece of content. But there have to be rules, otherwise the technology doesn't work. So the question is, what rules exist? There are tons of rules already. We need them enforced in a more rigorous and effective way so that we can recover some sense of rational civic discourse. When we cannot agree on whether a national election was stolen 4 years later, when tens of millions of people insist that that election was still stolen, when all empirical measures of the election was that it was actually the safest and most secure election in the history of the Republic, we have a problem. So you can then say, marketplace of ideas. Or you could say, let's try to grapple with the problem.
So maybe as just a closing question, one of the things I like about your reports is they have this very clear diagnosis, and then there's some realistic proposed solutions. But I guess I'm just wondering, are you hopeful? Are you hopeful that the solutions will be adopted? Are you hopeful that we can avoid some of these dire consequences for democracy that are kind of right in front of us in some sense?
As my wife will tell you, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool pessimist. But the great advantage that we pessimists have is low expectations. When my wife and I leave any of social event, particularly family events, my comment always is, oh, that could have been worse. Today I spent a very enjoyable afternoon over at the Ford Library, which focuses in significant part on the constitutional and civic crisis that Gerald R. Ford helped guide the country through. Very profound reminder that I cut my teeth as a political observer and junkie on Watergate. But it's been a long time since I thought about Gerald Ford, I'll admit. So we've come through crises. Life is in some ways, political life is a series of crises. And it's a question of how resilient you are, not avoiding the crisis, but how you respond to the crisis. We have a revolutionary new form of technology that was introduced beginning about 20 years ago, in earnest about a dozen years ago. It is in some ways not surprising that we are having something of a crisis in dealing with that new technology. Every new generation of technology brings those types of crises with it. Television did. Go back, to the 1500s and 1600s in the wake of the invention of the printing press and the dissemination of information, so that it wasn't only the Catholic Church and the kings who knew what was going on, and you had generations of global warfare that was in significant part exacerbated by the invention of the printing press. So things have unintended consequences. There are side effects to great technological advances that you would not want to call back, but that you have to figure out how to regulate and cope with and adjust to. So we're now in a period of rough adjustment that has been made much more challenging by political developments and political personalities that have introduced freestanding challenges. I'm a pessimist who thinks we will actually endure, but it sure feels like a very rocky road.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for this conversation.